So to build my homemade jointer, I started with one of those little Delta portable planers, and I took it apart to get the cutter head out of it, as well as the motor. The first challenge was to make some bearing flanges to fit around the ball bearings that are already pressed onto the cutter head, and making those out of birch plywood seemed to work. I had to mount the motor a little bit further away than it was on the original planer, so I had to buy a longer belt. The motor pivots on the shaft for belt tensioning. This is actually exactly the same shaft that was used in the original planer for tensioning the belt. Here, spinning it up for the first time. I'm spinning it up really slowly by controlling the voltage with a variac. So far so good, nothing exploding. Okay, let's try it at higher speed. So far I could spin the cutter head. Now to make a parallelogram mechanism to raise and lower the infeed table. The parallelogram mechanism uses some 3/8 inch steel shafts for everything to pivot on. My design really didn't leave any room for error, so I think I got lucky that it all fit together without having to make adjustments. It was a very tight fit. The advantage of a parallelogram mechanism is that it's much easier to keep the table from racking as it moves back and forth. The infeed and outfeed tables are made by gluing two pieces of 3/4 inch birch plywood together. So that gives me a 1.5 inch or 38mm thick sandwich, which will hopefully stay nice and flat. I'm using my homemade long reach C-clamps to apply some pressure in the middle of the sandwich. And lots of clamps around the edges. I screwed some machine screws into undersized holes in the bottom of the table, and here I'm cutting those off to leave just the studs sticking out of the bottom. Here's checking the fit for the table mount. I'm using these funny T-shaped knockdown fastener nuts to screw the rails onto the bottom of the table. Now this is just a test fit. For the actual mount, it's much more difficult to get at. So with the table in place, putting these T-nuts back in where they need to go is really fiddly. I shortened an Allen key so I could still get in there and actually turn the hex head on that screw. I was really keen to test things out, so even before I had the outfeed table mounted, I pushed a piece of wood across the cutter head to try it out. Just like I did for the infeed table, I'm also screwing some threaded rod straight into the wood, but this time I'm using much thicker threaded rod. And I've got two nuts on that threaded rod to turn it in, and here I'm just removing those. And that board was there to make sure that the thing went in there straight. Now putting a lock nut on each stud. These will help to support the table at the right level. Now by turning those nuts I can precisely adjust the height of each corner of the table. There's also some nuts that go on the bottom, but those are really fiddly to get in. There's a 3mm thick piece of steel that goes on top of each table, and here I'm putting a bevel on the edge that's going to go up against the cutter head. The sheet metal is actually held down with just a small number of number 4 wood screws. That holds it flat against the wooden table. So next I'm setting the outfeed table to be exactly parallel to the drum of the cutter head. And with the outfeed table set, I'm using its position to set the knives. I can't use the setting gauge that came with that planer because there's not enough room around it, and I decided to set the knives a little bit deeper than they were originally set in the planer. Next, I built a nice hand crank mechanism to do fine adjustments on the infeed side. And no jointer is complete without a fence. This fence isn't actually angle adjustable because I find I never ever use the bevel feature of my other jointer. And the guard for the cutter head. I never actually used a guard on my other jointer, but I don't really trust this jointer yet, so I figure a guard would be a useful thing to have. And here's adding the return spring for the guard. I should really replace this with a bigger spring, but this is the most suitable spring I had in my junk collection. Well, it seems to be working. More about this joiner in my next video.